So, I promised some people with money that if they gave me some of their money, I would make them a movie about money. This is that film about money. You probably think that this is money, and that banks are where your money is stored for safekeeping, guarded in big underground vaults by guys like Gustavo. Well, you're wrong, like really wrong, because it turns out that money is not a thing, and banks, in order to be banks, well, they need to be empty. Back in the old days, banks used to look like well-fortified temples. In fact, they were temples. Remember Jesus and the money changers? Nowadays, they've all turned into pharmacies and retail outlets. And actual banks these days now look like airport business class lounges. It's like they've given up even pretending that this is where they store the cash. I wonder why that is. Maybe if we made an awkward educational video on this subject, we could figure that out. So let's ask the question. What happens to your money when you deposit it in a bank? Here, for example, I am going to deposit $100.
Thanks, James. Your account has now been credited with $100. You will receive 1% interest, so in a year, your account will have grown to $101.
That's amazing, Ritu. But how does that happen? Does my money grow like a yogurt culture down in the vault with all the other money?
No, James. That doesn't make any sense.
So what happens?
It goes like this. If I have $100 of real cash and I put it in a bank, the bank gives me then the right to write checks for $100. But of course, they're not going to sit on that $100 waiting for me to write the checks. They're going to lend it out.
Right. They take my money and pay me 1% interest, and then they loan it out to other people and charge them higher interest. And the difference between those two interests is their profit. That makes some sense. So how much of my $100 does the bank get to loan out? And how much does the government require them to keep on reserve in case I need some money?
The reserve requirements are very small. You'd be surprised. If you put your money in the bank, you think they hold a lot of it and keep it safe for you. Actually, it's a very complicated formula, but for most banks, it turns out to be around 3%.
So, the bank sets aside a tiny fraction of my $100 and then takes the vast majority of the rest of it and as quickly as humanly possible gets rid of it. For example, the bank lends it to Sally on her credit card account so that Sally can, I don't know, go out and buy a Snuggie for her dog. So now a new bank account is credited with that money. That means that on top of the $100 that's credited to me in my bank, there's magically lots more dollars showing up in another bank. Sally's credit card debt has strangely created, well, more money. And what does this new bank do? It reserves a tiny fraction of Sally's debt and then lends the vast majority of that, what's left, to Frank, who goes out and buys, I don't know, a baby wall hanger. So now another bank magically has a new deposit it treats as money, even though it is just Frank's borrowed debt. In fact, Frank borrowed that debt from Sally's debt. It's just more debt. And that shows up, amazingly, not only as more debt, but as more money. And the bank that loan goes into takes that so-called money and uses it to, I don't know, finance a corporate merger or buy repackaged mortgages from another bank. And on and on and on.
Money is like a hot potato. Whoever holds it has to pass it on to somebody very quickly. A bank can't keep its money in the bank. They can't pay you interest, however low, without getting some.
This is what's known as the fractional banking system. As you can see, every time the banks move the money, their reserves go up a fraction, but the total money supply multiplies a lot. In short, this is not money. Money is not a thing.
The basic money is what the government prints and declares it will support. But banks have the capacity to kind of multiply that.
Here's the total amount of dollars in the world today. But here, according to the Federal Reserve Bank, is the total amount of money that's in the system. What makes up that huge difference?
Well, money is usually, except for cash, money is somebody's debt, somebody's IOU.
But I thought money was, money. Turns out money is a mushrooming, mutating pile of debt, of IOUs, of promises, sitting on top of another pile of debt and IOUs and promises.
Money is weird because it's the idea that we have in our heads. We represent it with physical tokens, but it's really based on this general idea of trust that's sort of captured in a token.
In other words, for money to be money, We all have to believe.
Yes, it's all a system of beliefs and therefore very fragile.
There's no way the bank actually has $10,000 for every person that has $10,000. But it doesn't matter because all you need to do is have the belief that there's $10,000 in the bank for you to be like, keep working on your day. And when you do need the $10,000, chances are not everybody else is going to need the $10,000 at the same time.
So, I believe money really is holy. It redeems itself.
We cover a dollar bill and like pictures of dead presidents. We put "In God We Trust" on it. We have a pyramid with an eye on it.
So what happens when somebody not as creditworthy as these guys gums up the works?
Things don't have to change very much for the banking system to begin to run into trouble.
And therein lies a tale to be told. In our last installment, we learned that money is not a thing.
Money is somebody's debt, somebody's IOU.
And not just any old IOU, but IOUs piled on top of IOUs in a seemingly endless chain. Cash money, the kind that Gustavo guards, actually makes up a tiny portion of what we call the total money supply. And we learned that banks actually keep very few of our dollars in their temple-like vaults.
We don't actually care how much money the bank actually has, as long as we're able to make the purchases that we need.
So basically, your money is in the bank as long as you believe it is, and as long as everybody else believes it is, even though everybody knows it isn't. But we also know that the Federal Reserve Bank, which is kind of sort of part of the government, well, they do print money, and this money somehow gets into circulation in the economy. How do they do that?
Here's one way. You could load up a lot of big bags full of fresh new $50 bills, pick them up in an airplane, and each day over a period of a month go to a different American city and announce that at 12 o'clock we're going to open it up, the airplane flying over the city, and everybody should get out there with a garbage bag and collect it. Would that increase the money in circulation? Absolutely. Who would it benefit? The people who had big bags in the right cities at the right time. We don't do that. What we do is a very peculiar procedure. The Federal Reserve basically gives the money under various conditions to large banks. End of story. And it gives them the money and it says, please take this extra money that we're giving you, most of the time cost-free, and please lend it into the economy so it circulates. Lend it out. The banks cooperate since they're getting cheap or costless money, which they then lend out at interest.
This system has gone on steroids since the economic meltdown of 2008, with the Fed and the US Treasury pumping literally trillions of dollars into the banking system. But what have the banks done with all that free cash?
The special investments that we like them to make are loans. We want them to make loans, specifically to businesses or individuals that can't get money to invest in other ways. But what will they actually do, the banks? Kind of whatever works for them.
Well, banks have options. The option we had hoped for was that they would lend it out to individuals and to businesses, and so the money would circulate. The banks decided to do otherwise. They said to the government, you are running a big deficit. Here's your solution. You need to borrow the difference. This magic can be done if you borrow money from us. And here's very important for you to understand. The banks took the bulk of the money made available to them by the Federal Reserve and lent it to the government with the following arrangement. The rate of interest paid by banks to the Federal Reserve for fresh new money has hovered around 0.5%. The rate of return paid by the US Treasury for the money it borrows from those same banks, 2 to 3%. If you understand that, you'll understand why the banks have recovered and nobody else has.
Okay, so that's what's happening now after the 2008 crash. But I still don't understand how we got so close to the financial brink. I mean, I heard all about the deregulation from the Clinton years, the mortgage-backed securities, the criminal settlements with the banks. But was there some deeper underlying cause to this crisis?
Over the last 40 years, real wages have been stagnating or declining, and yet productivity has shot up. So the banks have more and more money because that's a profitable situation, productivity doubling and your workers getting very little money. So the bank has to do something with it. And they got a bright idea. Well, it's really a desperate idea. They said, I know what we'll do. Instead of paying you to buy what we produce, we'll lend you the money. That was a bright idea. Well, that is a very short-run idea. I mean, if I don't have $10 this year and I borrow, how am I going to have $15 and my wages aren't going up? How am I going to have $15 next year to pay you back with interest?
So how did consumption go up in the last 40 years? Debt. Every time you use a credit card, you're borrowing. That's what that is. You're borrowing money. It's done electronically, but it's a debt. We made debt part of everybody's life. We gave the working class of America rising debts instead of rising wages. But when everything becomes debt, when every transaction for a bottle of water is in fact a debt, the banks who handle all debts become masters of the universe.
But at the end of the day, whether it's tax dollars, the Federal Reserve printing money, or your deposits, isn't it our money that the banks are playing with?
You're lending money to the bank when you deposit money. And this is what we forget. We forget that we are making a loan and we don't behave as creditors, and therefore they don't treat us as creditors. It's like, can I keep playing with that kind of money? Those creditors, depositors are such nice people. They let me play with no contract, no strings attached.
To make this system work, the banks need to constantly move the debt they owe you as a depositor to the debt you owe them as a credit card user and mortgage holder. So from an ethical outlook, they want you to look like this, but they want you, in fact, they need you to party with your credit cards like that, which is probably why we're all a little bit confused about what our society wants us to be. I mean, think of it this way. We spend $1 trillion a year on advertising, making irrational appeals to ourselves to buy stuff that we'll have to borrow money in order to own. The goal is, in fact, to make you act like a bank, to take your short-term earnings, your paycheck, and turn it into long-term debts, credit card balances, and mortgages. It's not so much that corporations are becoming people, which they are, as that people are becoming corporations. And the story of that dollar that you put in the bank, well, that's kind of like the story of how you want to look like this, but in fact, you kind of look like this. Not too dignified, I know, but if it weren't for that kind of delusion, and delusion on an awesome scale, the economy as we know it wouldn't exist. And if it's any consolation, though it's probably not, banks need the same delusions you do, which is why I wish that banks would go back to looking like temples. You know, in the olden days, the very center of the temple, the Holy of Holies, well, it was empty, but at least it was something you could believe in.